I'm supposed to introduce the next speaker, Dr. Charles Kay. Dr. Kay used to be at the University of Idaho.
No.
Whereabouts?
I got my bachelor's and master's at the University of Montana.
Okay, it was University of Montana. But anyway, I first met Charles at a Moose conference a number of years ago, and he's published some very, very interesting papers. And he's focused over the last few years on elk in Yellowstone. And some of the papers he's produced, particularly when it comes to the Aboriginal relationship between big game and Aboriginal peoples, is quite fascinating. So with that short introduction, which I found out just before I come up here, Dr. Charles Kay. Charles?
If I don't use notes, you're going to be here for 4 hours, okay? When I was contacted, this is no joke. He said I could have as much time as I wanted. You never want to tell me that, okay? When I started on my PhD on elk in Yellowstone in '86, I had 3 apple boxes full of academic studies. I have 60 file cabinets full of academic studies. Unlike most wildlife biologists, I spent a great deal of time summarizing and interpreting the archaeological record back 10, 12,000 years. I hate to say I have them all, but I think I have all first-person journals of exploration in the western part of North America, which of course includes Canada. I worked extensively in Yellowstone, and I've also done consulting for Parks Canada. I've recently finished a book that it turns out no one wants to publish, so I'll probably have to publish it myself next year. It's called Yellowstone Ecological Malpractice. Subtitled Myths, Lies, and Scientific Fraud. What I object to, I mean, if you want to, I don't have a skin in this game, okay? I'm not a Canadian. I don't have a vote on this type of stuff. I'm not here to try to tell you how to manage your wildlife. What I object to is all the lying on the wolf and predation issue, as well as the total corruption of the scientific process, okay? We'll see if with that, I'm just going to do this and do that, and hopefully. Okay, so we're going to start with one of the greatest liars of all, and he turns out to be a Canadian. And there's a reason for this. I mean, I'm assuming most of you know about Farley Mowat, and he wrote the book Never Cry Wolf. Now, at the time that book was published, which was sometime in the 60s, if I remember right, it was very critically reviewed in academic journals. But nobody besides myself and Val and a few other people ever read academic journals. So the public didn't know that he had wolf biology entirely incorrect. Okay? Wolves do not live by eating lemmings. Okay? Well, that's what he said in the book, okay? Which was, of course, later made into a movie by Walt Disney that millions and millions of people saw. And that's, a number of years later, the Canadian Wildlife Service put all his timesheets or work records in the whatever archives it was, and there was an investigative reporter that went through and dug all that through that stuff with a fine-tooth comb. That was sometime in the 80s, and I forget the man's name. And what he found out that is Farley Mowat was not at the places he said he was at the times in the book. So basically, he fabricated the entire book. Okay? And then he confronted him. He interviewed him, sat down and interviewed him. And what Farley Mowat said is that the ends, protecting wolves justifies the means of lying, and that he would do it again if given the chance. And where you have this problem, this is a screenshot, okay? This is from Amazon, and I just checked it again. This slide's a couple years old, but what's it still being sold at? It's being sold at across the internet as an amazing true story. And so is the movie. And it's all a lie. And if you've ever been on Amazon, I buy a lot of books. You can put your own reviews on there, public reviews. personal reviews, and I think there's 144, whatever it was the last time I looked, and aside from one or two, they all love it. I think it's all true. About that same time, a man named Maurice Hornacher did the first detailed, supposedly scientific study of mountain lion predation on elk and mule deer, and to some degree sheep, in the central Idaho wilderness. It's the river of no return. It's the Middle Fork of the Salmon River, and he was specifically on Big Creek. And I pulled this off the internet. Someone sent it to me, and it's a little out of focus, but it's amazing now the photos that you can get, people get with the camera. So here's a cat taking down and killing a 6-point bull elk. Now, Hornacher's mountain lion study, he came to two main conclusions: is that the mountain lions self-regulate. They purposely keep their population below a level where it has any impact on the prey population. Well, he was either incompetent or a liar, because that's not how evolution works. The predators are in the business of turning prey animals into other predators as quickly as possible, both lions and wolves. And then he also said that based on how many elk and deer that were being killed by lions in his study area, the cats were having an insignificant impact on the prey population. And for some reason, since he didn't believe the first part of it, I didn't believe the second part of it. But I could never prove that he was lying until I met a man named George Dovel, D-O-V-E-L. At that time, when Hornacher was doing this research, the governor of Idaho did not trust him. So he hired a man, George, to follow him around to the 2 or 3 years of the study. And so I asked George, how was it done? What did he do? He said it was simple. Okay, because there's ways of lying where it's almost impossible to get caught, and this is one way that he did it. Instead of using the state's estimate of how many elk and deer were in the Big Creek, Middle Fork of the Salmon area where his study area was, he used his own population estimate, which was 3 or 4 times higher than the state estimate. So if you're estimating there's 1,000 elk and deer, and the mountain lions are killing 100 out of that, well, that doesn't have much of an impact. But if there's only 300 elk and deer, and they're killing 100 of them, I mean, you do the math. It's simple math. And that was one of the foundation studies as far as mountain lion predation. Okay. So he overestimated the amount of deer, and he overestimated the amount of elk. Do you have this down here now? That's the way it was in Idaho, too, before they, did what? There have been probably 60 or 80 detailed mountain lion studies now over the years. And on average, this is the average now, mountain lions kill an average of 50 deer a year. The lowest kill are the single males. They kill around 30. And the cats that have the highest kill rate are females with dependent young. If they've got 3 young that are almost full grown, they'll kill almost 100 deer a year. This is all documented in scientific studies. It's not my data. Other people collected the data. I just synthesize it and then make it available to the public. In my home state of Utah, the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources estimate there's a minimum of 3,000 cats, mountain lions in the state. Do the math, 3,000 times 50, 150,000 deer a year being killed by cats. Hunters are killing less than 30,000 deer a year. Plus the state says they've spent $70 million restoring mule deer habitat. And you know how many more mule deer the hunters have put in the bag? The number is between 0 and 1. This is actually a friend of mine and a deer from Wyoming. Well, in the whole western United States, there's a book called The Desert Puma, written by some of Hornacher's co-workers on it, and they figured a minimum there's 30,000 lions in the western United States. Again, 30,000 times 50 is 1.5 million deer a year, or deer equivalents, that the cats are killing. And on average, the hunters are only killing less than 300,000 deer a year. Again, you do the math. Next slide. This is actually a picture that I took up in Alaska. I worked up there for a couple years for Alaska Fish and Game on surveillance when they built the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. And we worked 10 days on and 4 days off. And I'd spend my off time down in what used to be called McKinley National Park. It's now called Denali National Park. And this is off the bridge off the Teclanica River. And that grizzly tried for 3 or 4 hours. There's 2 moose calves standing underneath that cow there to kill those calves. So it's been known for a long time that bears like to eat calves, but only recently has it been known exactly what the rate is, because it's very hard to get data onto this new technology that came out. And the technology was developed by the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, and again, this was published in an academic study. What they did is they took a GPS collar and they put a little small digital camera in it, okay? And then they set the collar so it would take a GPS reading every 15 minutes. And then it would take a video clip. So you can actually watch the bears killing the calves, okay? And they ran this for 30 days, because if you do it that frequently, the problem with collars is the battery life. So the more frequently you take a reading, the less time you have for the batteries. So guess how many calves the bears eat? On average, and this is a combination of moose and caribou calves, it's in the Nalchina Basin, which is the central part of Alaska. On average, the bears killed 34 calves in 30 days. The maximum was 44 calves in 30 days. Okay? I mean, I've studied this predation stuff for a very long time because I'm interested in long-term ecosystem states and processes, what the predators did and the native people did. And you think you've seen everything when you get hair that's this color or it's totally gone. But man, it shocked me, okay? How do you like the claws on that one? Anybody not recognize what species that is? Okay, there's an additional problem with grizzlies. I mean, they'll kill a few adults, but the other thing they do, of course, is steal wolf kills. Well, once they steal the wolf kill, the wolves are still hungry, so what do the wolves do? They go out and kill again. So the kill rate goes up. This is called kleptoparrotism, if you want a new word for today to learn. Next slide. And the same thing happens with black bears. And there's not much data on kleptoparrotism in grizzly bears, but there is actually data on kleptoparrotism on black bears in California on black-tailed deer and in Colorado on mule deer. And when the bears are up and about, because they steal so many lion kills, the lions increase their kill rate by 48%. Okay? And again, this is not my data. It's in a published scientific paper that, of course, you don't read and no one's going to tell you about except me, which is why I got invited here. Next slide, please. Of course, you're Canadian, so you all should recognize this. This is from taken on top of the gondola lift on Sulphur Mountain in Banff National Park. And of course, this is Banff right here in the Trans-Canada and the railroad. Okay, wolves were killed out throughout southern Canada due to a rabies scare in the 1970s, 1950s. They just poisoned what they would call it, bejesus out of everything, because they wanted to stop the rabies. And so this included the national parks. And then over time, I mean, they never killed out all the bear or the wolves in the North Country because there just wasn't enough people living there to justify the cost. Next slide. So this is Parks Canada's data. Okay. This is Banff. These are the red dots. This gives you some idea. There was approximately, and these are just counts, okay? If you know anything about wildlife management at all, you get up in a helicopter and you think you see everything, but you don't, okay? It has to do with, there's all sorts of citability issues, and I could talk about that for another hour or two, too. But so this is a minimum number of wolves, and Cliff White was the ecologist in Banff that I've worked with for a number of years. And they figured there might have been 2,000 elk in the bow before the wolves came in. Okay, next slide. And just watch what happens. Next slide. Next slide. We call that the Banff blob. Next slide. And so the red things are the radio-collared wolves. In this pack, there was one pack west of town, and there was one pack, the green things, to the east of town, and the purple things are all the elk, okay? Now, I don't know about you, but I think there's a pattern there. They had a hell of a time trying to get them off the golf course, okay? I mean, I'm not a golfer, but we walked out there and looked at that. I mean, you know, instead of just having one thing where you sort of put the golf ball in, those elk, those hooves were just, you know, punching another cup down every time they took a step or two. But it was a great place to to take pictures of elk. Next slide, please. Okay. I don't know how many of you have been out of east of Banff. This is called the Yahatinda, which I think means mountain grassland in some Aboriginal language and things. This is on the Red Deer River. The Red Deer would be over here, and you're looking into Banff National Park. The boundary is about back in here, someplace. This is owned by Parks Canada, but it's in fee simple title. It's not part of the park. So it's open to sport hunting, as I understand it, mostly, or at least now, 6-point bulls by permit. And of course, it's open to unlimited hunting by native people and a Métis. In the 85, back in the 80s, before the wolves came into Banff on it, there was as many as 3,000 elk would winter on this area. And it was primarily a wintering area. What Parks Canada use it for, this is their horse ranch. This is where they breed their horses, and where they winter all their horses that are used by the wardens throughout the park. As the grizzly bears numbered and started to increase in the park, they the wardens stopped shooting them. The wolf numbers came in, and wolves colonized it. Not only did the number of elk fall, but they stopped migrating back into Banff. Okay. So one of the things I'm going to tell you, which I think you're not going to like after you spent $30,000 buying habitat, but turns out habitat is irrelevant. Okay? The habitat is still there. After all, it's in a national park. Plus, they've burnt 35,000 acres over the years, not to increase elk habitat per se, but because of their mandate to maintain ecological integrity. And long before they met me, they realized it was fire, and that all the fire is native burning. It has nothing to do with lightning strikes whatsoever on that thing. And there's still a study going. It's being run out of the University of Alberta. At the present time, there's only around 300 elk left. 12% of those elk go summer in the park. 59% of those elk live full-time year-round in the Yahatinda. And what is the most interesting thing that just started the last couple of years, 29% of the elk actually go east. They go out into where those blankety-blank loggers are cutting trees, and those blankety-blank people are punching holes down the ground to get natural resources out of it. So why would they leave or not go into a pristine area with great habitat, or even stay here, but they're going out there into the active gas and forest products area. Again, the habitat is still there, but the elk aren't.
There's no special season for mating in BC.
Pardon?
There's no special hunting rights in BC for mating.
I have no idea what your things are up here and stuff. This is not in BC, this is on the Alberta side. Okay. Next slide, please. This puts new meaning to the old phrase about tear him a new you-know-what. Wolves did it. No ungulate in his right mind wants to be back there with a wolves. Next slide, please. So this is Yellowstone Park. Most of the controversy and things that I worked on as far as long-term ecosystem states and management and how things used to be in the park before it was a park is on the northern range. But there's a number of elk herds in the Yellowstone ecosystem. And there's one on what's called on the Firehole and Gibbon rivers in the central part of the park. Next slide. Okay. Again, this is published data. This was in a book about 4 inches thick on this area. This is the Gibbon here. This is the Firehole. Old Faithful's down here. Flows in this direction and flows in this direction. At the junction, it's called the Madison River, goes out here, and West Yellowstone is here. The roads come up through here and up through here and up through here. And the color index, the hotter the color is, the more the elk use it, okay? And the important point about this elk herd is there's no hunting on this elk herd, because this elk herd does not go outside the park. It just stays in those thermal areas. It's been studied for 50, 60 years on and off. And before they put wolves, and they didn't put wolves right here, they put them on the northern range, but of course the animals don't stay where you put them and stuff. So some of the wolves wound up over here. Next slide, please. So this is about 2 years later. That was no wolves, colonizing wolves. And next slide, please. And so basically, again, habitat's irrelevant. The habitat is still here. It's a national park, but there's no elk. And before the wolves came, the Park Service estimated there was 1,200 elk in that herd. They're down to only around 100, with the researchers predicting extinction from wolves, okay? Next slide, please. In fact, the elk would already be extinct if it was not for the deep water areas in the Madison River. That's where the hottest things are in the last slide. I apologize for the slide, but this came out of their book. There's the Madison River, the elk are standing there. All ungulates, when they're attacked by predators, try to flee into water, because with their longer legs, it gives them an advantage. So the elk can stand out there with water halfway up their bellies, but the wolves have to swim to them. And the elk can either fend them off or kill them on it like that. So that's why those elk are surviving. Next slide. Now, the elk did try to flee into the Gibbon and the Firehole rivers, but they're generally too shallow to, the wolves just wait out there and kill them. And the reason the Madison and the Gibbon don't freeze in the wintertime, even if it's 50 below, is because you have all those thermal areas and hot springs that feed into it. And so this is a very deep snow area. They might have 3 or 4 foot of snow on the level by the end of the winter there and stuff, but the elk just survive in those thermal areas because basically the hot ground melts the snow and the grass is exposed, or the sedges, and the elk eat it. Next slide, please. Again, the wolves just wait out there and kill the elk. To reiterate, guess the next slide, please. Isn't this better than trying to, my big thumbs? Again, the habitat's there, but the animals are not. About this time, next slide, please. You might be wondering, how are there any wolves left since the elk are down to just less than 100, and the wolves can't get to them because they're standing in those deep water areas? Well, there's about 1,500 bison that winter in this system too. And they switched to killing bison, not very many of them. When they went out and, how do I want to say this? Well, I just might as well insult you, what the hell? They're Canadian wolves. You can have them back. Yeah, I know. I know. And they made a special effort. They got them mostly, as I understand it, from the Alberta side, but I wasn't involved in all that. And, of course, the Park Service wishes I'd fall off the end of the earth. So they particularly, because they knew most of the animals, especially the northern range, were elk, so they went and found wolves that were preying on elk. Because as strange as it sounds, the wolves have to learn what to kill, okay? And there's different techniques that they use, and these wolves, unlike the ones in Wood Buffalo National Park, have not mastered how to kill bison. So they kill actually very few of the bison. But this is what's called predator-mediated competition. Next slide, please. Okay. Now say if you just have, on a piece of ground, if you just have mule deer and mountain lions, the cats can only take the deer so low till they start running out of the prey animals, and they just can't find the last few. Now you would think if you put a second prey animal in there like elk, that would buffer or reduce the predation pressure on the first species. But that's not how it works in the real world. The cats switched to killing elk, and whenever they run across a more vulnerable mule deer, they kill it. And they actually take the most susceptible ungulate down to low levels or extinction. And it turns out the important part about this is the rule rather than the exception with all predation. Okay? And of course, nobody talks about this. Have you ever heard about this before? Anybody? Predator-mediated competition? It's also called the parent competition. Next slide, please. I've also done a number of private consulting things over the years, either through my own private consulting business, such as in this case, this is in San Juan County. It's in the southeast corner of Utah. It's one of the largest counties in Utah, and it's one of the least populated. And these are actually the bears here, Here's here. I don't know how much you follow politics, but this is where the president before the current president put somewhere just south of 2 million acres in a national monument called the Bears Ear National Monument. And irrespective of what you think of Trump, he took about 1.8 million acres of that out. Okay? And in the distance, this doesn't mean anything to you, but it means things to me. This is Navajo Mountain on the Navajo Indian Reservation. This is 50 Mile Mountain. You want to see a remote country, try getting to that piece out there. There ain't no water, so you better pack it for your horse. And it's 1,000 feet right up the cliffs on a trail. Well, the cowboys ride their horses up and down it, but I sure wouldn't. The point about this, talking about this, is there's nothing out here in the Bears Ears where the game departments in the West, if you know anything about the Western United States, the mule deer populations are declining in all the Western states. There's nothing out here that the game departments throughout the West habitually blame for the decline of mule deer. There hasn't been any new anything in the last 50 to 60 years. No new logging, no new oil and gas, no new anything. Nobody lives out here, okay? There's only a few sections of private land that are grazed by cattle in the summertime. The grazing, this is Forest Service here. It's all Forest Service of BLM. It's all federal land. The ranch on the north is owned by Nature Conservancy, and the allotments on the south are known by the Southern Ute tribe and haven't been pastured in 30 or 40 years. Next slide, please. Again, no oil and gas, an extremely rugged area. There's a few jeep roads through this area. You're looking to the east here. These are the Abajo Mountains, and these are the La Salles. If you've been to Moab, Moab would be down over here. Next slide, please. Exceedingly rough area. Exceedingly remote. Next slide, please. So these data, again, they're not my data. I didn't collect these data, so you can't blame me for this. If you don't like the data, blame the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources. These are the number of deer that were killed off of the Elk Ridge unit, and the data only goes back to 1950, okay? Right in here, so from 1950 to about 1970, they killed 2,500 deer a year off this unit, 1,000 of which were does, okay? Then right in here, they protected mountain lions, they protected black bears, and the federal government banned the use of poisons, primarily 1080, on public lands. And there's sort of a pattern here. And this is almost unheard of in the western states. The deer numbers dropped so low that they actually closed the season for 4 years. I mean, this never, I don't know if it happens up here in Canada, but it never happens any place in the western United States. They got to keep selling those licenses to keep the biologists employed. And then they reopened it as a limited entry, bucks only unit. 3 different hunts, muzzleloader, archery, and gun at different times of the year. This data only goes to 2004. It's been continuing out to 2018. At the present time, 1 cat alone will kill more deer than all the muzzleloader, gun, and archery hunters combined. There's a big lake in northern Utah. It's called the Great Salt Lake. And in that lake, there's a big island called Antelope Island. It used to be private property. It's now a state park. They have mule deer out there. It's very poor mule deer habitat because we have this annual grass called cheatgrass, which increases the fire frequency a lot higher than it ever was. So most of the shrubs that the deer would need in the wintertime are gone. So it's poor mule deer habitat, but the mule deer are increasing because there are no lions. So, and the DWR is afraid of the population becoming so high that the deer are going to starve to death. So they've caught deer out of Antelope Island, turned them loose on Elk Ridge. Well, they just provided a snack for the land thing. And the other important point about this, there's two other important points. This is really not Elk Ridge. This is E period, L period, K period, named after the early Texas outfit that first ran cattle back here in the late 1800s. Elk did not show up here to about here, and according to the locals, they caught DWR with a horse trailer full of elk, doing an illegal elk transplant. Now, that's not what DWR says, okay, but I'm telling you what the ranchers say. And my experience in Utah is that I'd believe the ranchers before I'd believe DWR. Well, I've been involved in various legal issues there, working for lawyers, and I can say this because the lawyers say that, so I'm quoting the lawyer here. What the lawyer, Tom Bachtel, is fond of saying is, the only thing DWR is expert at, and they of course claim to be the wildlife expert, the only thing they're expert at is lying. Okay, so this is predator-mediated competition. This is an example of predator-mediated competition. Put the elk in here on it. The lions just drive the deer down and down and down. Next slide. So this is where it gets more political as far as what you're interested in. It's what's happening to the woodland and mountain caribou. I mean, they're going extinct. They are going to go extinct. It has nothing to do with logging and oil and gas or anything else. It's predator-mediated competition because you have moose in a system where you never had moose before on that type of stuff on it. And so whenever they run across a more vulnerable caribou, they just kill it. I mean, if it was what the people try to tell you, that it's logging and oil and gas or development, what happened to the caribou in Kootenai National Park? What happened to caribou in Banff? It's 0. The last time I'd heard of the caribou numbers in Jasper, it was 650, sometime in the late 50s. And the last time I saw a number out of Jasper, it was down to 20. Then you have those islands in Lake Superior that's not supposed to freeze anymore because of global warming. It froze last winter. The wolves made it out to the Slade Islands, wiped out the caribou. I can't pronounce the name of that island that's in Ontario to the east, that had 400 or 500 caribou on it. The wolves just wiped them right off. And I can't pronounce the name of the national park on the north shore of Lake Superior, where the wolves finally just did in the woodland caribou.
It's called Pakistan.
Okay, and what's the other one then? The one with the M. The island in Ontario, it's an Ontario state park, but there's no development. Yeah, okay. Hey, you can tell I'm not a Canadian, okay? I barely speak English. Next slide, please. Okay. Create a woodland caribou sanctuary. What is Dr. Decker talking about? Dr. Decker ran the Canadian Wolf Defenders for 15 years. Dr. Decker and I are friends. He's the only rational wolf advocate I've ever met. He does not lie. So what's his idea here? He knows they're going extinct. It has nothing to do with habitat, okay? So what he wants to do is you need to fence, pick out whatever you think good caribou habitat is, fence it, electrify the fence, catch all the predators, throw the predators out, don't let the predators ever back in, turn the woodland caribou loose. So when you want to see woodland or mountain caribou, you go to this national park and they'll be safe there because there's no predators. Okay? Next slide, please. Okay, so now we get to the really nasty stuff. This is not my drawing. Okay, this is figure 1. This is before, under the Endangered Species Act, before they can do anything with an endangered species, they have to come up with what's called a recovery plan. So this figure was right from the wolf recovery plan, where they put your wolves in the northern Rockies. And so for you that don't or aren't familiar with the geography of northern Utah, this is Glacier National Park. These hashed areas are designated wilderness areas on the national forest, okay? This is Yellowstone down here, designated wilderness areas. This is the Central Idaho Wilderness Area. Hornacker's study was in here, type of stuff like that. So a couple things to learn from this. I mean, this map was either done by the most incompetent wolf biologist on the planet, or the whole purpose of this was what we call rural cleansing. Okay? Now, you don't realize what this is. This is a potential wolf dispersal corridor. Well, what is this? That's the Continental Divide. I mean, when do wolves disperse? Well, they've already dispersed for this time of year. What does the world look like on top of the Continental Divide in February and March? Wolves do not disperse down mountaintops. They disperse down valleys. But what's in the valleys? Private land and all the livestock. Okay? The other thing to notice is there's 3 small recovery areas. There are not wolves spread all through this and into Washington and Oregon and all sorts of other places. According to the recovery plan, and this drove the whole EIS process, drew all the wolf modeling as far as impacts and everything else. 100 wolves here, 100 wolves here, 100 wolves here. No connectivity was required. It was not discussed in any of the EIS documents on that thing. And when the 100 wolves were here for 3 years and 3 years and 3 years, the population would be deregulated and then returned to the states, which the states could then do hunting on them. So what actually happened? Well, according to Dr. David Meach, and he's a senior wolf biologist of the federal government in the United States, on that type of stuff, and you have to go to the declaration in the first delisting lawsuit. There were at least 5 lawsuits over delisting, but what Dr. Meach said in his delisting lawsuit, this whole area was full with wolves, and there was at least 3,000 wolves. So what did the judge do? And this was a hand-picked, it's called judge shopping, and I can explain that, how you're interested in it, how they picked this judge, Malloy, in Missoula, in the Federal Circuit Court. He put wolves back on the endangered species list. Not once, but twice, because there weren't enough wolves. Okay, this is what's called legislating from the bench. Plus, he said there had to be all this genetic connectivity between all these 3 populations. So it wasn't mentioned once in the whole EIS public process, but he mentioned it in his ruling like 49 times. What does a federal judge know about connectivity and wolves? Next slide, please. According to all the modeling that was done by the federal government, the wolves were not going to have any significant impact on the ungulate populations in the Yellowstone ecosystem. Okay? It's right there in black and white. I'm not making this stuff up. Okay? So what really happened? On the northern herd, the big northern herd, where all the debate has been for almost 100 years about elk overgrazing and the destruction of riparian areas and the destruction of aspen and willow communities, which I worked on for my dissertation. There was a count again. This is a count. They counted over 19,000 elk before they turned the wolves loose in '95. They dropped the elk. The wolves dropped the elk like a stone. It was around below 4,000, and it sort of stabilized at 5,000. And what I had told, I haven't seen the numbers this year because they weren't available until after I left. It's down in the 3,000s again. Okay. Plus, the whole distribution of the elk have changed. Historically, when they counted like they counted those 19,000 elk and the other earlier elk counts, 80% or so of the elk were actually in Yellowstone Park. Now there's hardly any elk in the park during winter. During the count, again, not this winter, 2 years ago, of the 5,100 and some elk they counted, there was only 578 in the park. Okay? The elk have moved way far north of the park. Now that is far as they can get from the wolves. Okay? They're out on private land where they're not supposed to be, and they all have brucellosis, or a high percentage of them do. They were winning on private land. Next slide, please. And you can probably guess what they did to the moose population. There weren't that many moose, and now there's virtually zero. Next slide, please. Also, to avoid wolves in the park, just like on the Yaha Tinda, a large number of the elk, and the Fish and Game denies exactly how many there are now wintering on private land outside the park year-round. Note all the little bitty cavies right here. Of course, the elk found the alfalfa field on that stuff on it. But you can normally see 100 to 200 elk in at least 4 or 5 different sites outside the park. There's also elk that now live year-round in the town of Gardner, which never happened before. And there's also elk that live year-round in a little campground, the Slough Creek campground outside of Gardner. Completely changed everything. None of this was predicted in the EIS. Not a word of what I was talking about was predicted in the EIS. And when I wrote a popular publication for Peterson's Hunting, laying out all these potential problems with the EIS, the federal government tried to have me fired. Okay? And what they said, they called up the president of the university and they called up the department chairman, and they said, based on what I wrote, his field agent, Ed Bang's field agents, were going to be targeted by those, quote, neo-Nazis in Montana. They would shoot them up. Well, how would you like to have somebody say something like that, to the president of your university? But luckily, the only thing I didn't mention in the introduction, I'm a wildlife ecologist. I got my PhD on that side of campus. And then I moved over to the other side of campus because Randy Simmons, who was chairman of the political science department, gave me political asylum. Again, this is no joke. I spent 26 years, almost 26 years, in the political science department at Utah State University doing ecological research on soft money. And then too many people of a certain political persuasion got hired by the political science department, and then Randy had an offer of a chair, an endowed chair over in the business school in economics, so he took the money and run, and then he moved me over to economics. So I think, I can say it until somebody proves me wrong, I'm the only wildlife biologist on earth who spent 3 or 4 years in the economics department, in a business school. Again, all I did was ecological research. Next slide, please. Okay, this is actually a figure from my dissertation, because one other thing I do is all this detailed analysis of first-person historical journals, and you don't pick out snippets. That's totally inappropriate. You have to do continuous time analysis, okay? So this is the boundary approximately Yellowstone Park. It's 2.2 million areas. All the spaghetti-like stuff is the approximate location of the early explorers. Between 1835 and 1876, there were 26 different expositions that lift us first-person written accounts. How many times do you think they saw or kill a wolf? 765 days on foot or horseback between 1835 and 1876. 0. Okay? At the present time, there's over 5,000 buffalo in the park. And the Park Service claims this is natural. It's the way the world's always been. How many buffalo do you think were seen during the same times in the park? 0. One buffalo was seen out here, buffalo were seen, not one buffalo, out here at Henry's Lake, and buffalo were seen twice here to the south in Jackson Hole, and elk were only seen once every 18 days. It's done a similar analysis for Parks Canada in the Canadian Rockies. Elk were only seen once every 31 days in the Canadian Rockies, the actual Cordilla part of it. These are the data. Everything else is scientific fraud. Next slide, please. Okay. Wolves, keystone predation, and trophic cascades in Yellowstone National Park. I don't know if you see much of it down here, but this is all over the internet. This is all over academic journals, how wolves are saving the park. They've reduced the elk herd, which they weren't supposed to do, and all the aspen and willows have regenerated. And they've even saved the rivers in Yellowstone. There's a video on this, and the last time I looked, there was like 35 million hits, and everybody loves it, except for the fact that the British who did it called elk deer. But, okay? So this is every place. Everybody's bought into this type of stuff. This is a view of the Lamar River. This is Soda Butte Creek coming in here. Do you see any aspen or willows or cottonwoods or beaver or biodiversity? Okay, next slide, please. What if your riparian areas looked like this? What would happen to you on public land here in BC? This is in Yellowstone Park. It's Rose Creek. You see all the cutthroat trout, the beaver, the riparian songbirds. I mean, isn't that just great? Next slide, please. The first slide was looking west, and this slide is looking east. This is what the old Buffalo Ranch was, right here. So what these people have done is they've cherry-picked the data. It's another way to lie, okay? They did not do a random sampling of everything in the park. There are certainly places where the willows and the aspen have recovered. And they appear to be at the upper elevations and on north aspects where there would be deeper snow, where if the elk and wool, if there's wolves in there, the elk don't want to be anywhere near that because it's easier for the wolves to kill them. Now, as part of my dissertation research, I have 81 data points dating to 1893 in aspen stands on the northern range, and I have 44 data points of tall willow communities, again dating to 1893 on the winter range. So I didn't pick these data points. I've looked at more than 50,000 images throughout archives throughout all the United States, even back to the National Archives in Washington, D.C. If you want a picture of Old Faithful 3 or 4 times a year going back to 1872, they're there. But there aren't many pictures of aspen and willows because the northern range is not scenic, because there are almost virtually no thermal areas and stuff on that. And so my data points that I'm going to talk to you about, I didn't pick them, other people picked them, took the original photo. So these data points are in there before the wolves came in. So there's no selection on my part. Next slide, please. This is Company D of the Minnesota National Guard on patrol in Yellowstone. As you may or may not know, park created in 1872, first national park. There was no National Park Service until 1916, and for 30 years the military ran Yellowstone. This is an 1893 photo taken by F.J. Haynes. This is all aspen. Notice it has branches all the way to the ground. There's no grazing whatsoever. There's been no browsing on these aspen stands. Okay? There's no bark damage on these aspen stands. There's no nothing. As far as I know, to the best of my knowledge, there's only 5 sets of photos in the western United States that are BS and BC, before sheep and before cattle. Okay? The only person, I've repeated 4 of those, and someone else has repeated the whole 5th set. All the very palatable browse pants show no browsing whatsoever. This idea that the West teemed with all this wildlife, it's just mythology. Next slide, please. So that's the way it looked in 1988. Spruce is all highline. I mean, the aspen, the repeat photos in the aspen shows it's more than 95%. Aspen has exceedingly high biodiversity. Nobody really gives a damn. Unless, of course, they can use biodiversity to shut something down. Next slide. So that's 88, part of my research. This is the way it looks today. Those last 2 trees have died. There's a few suckers that are still left. Next slide, please. Okay, this is that same Company D of the Minnesota National Guard. This place is called Yancey's Hole. The first set of repeat photos was viewed to the west, and this is viewed to the east. You can see all the streams come down through there, Lost Creek on it. These people are standing on a hay rack. They hayed these things. There was a motel here on it. And there's all these tall willows. Next slide, please. That's the way it looked in 88. The water's still there, but the willows aren't, okay? Next slide, please. And that's the way it looks today. This whole thing burnt, actually. It all went through the fires in 88. So of the 81 repeat photos of aspen stands that I have dating before the wolves were introduced, none of them show any recovery. 0. Okay? And of the willow stands, next slide, please. Of the 44 that I have of repeat photographs, of tall willow communities, there's only 1 that shows any recovery. It's the very upper end of the northern range by Pebble Creek, and there's no elk there anymore. The snow's deep, and with wolves in the system, the elk are gone. This is a photo from a book by a man named Bailey, an early naturalist in the park, about 1919. By that time, the elk numbers had come up. You can see the high lining on these willows right here, and according to the caption on this photo in the book, the elk browsing had killed out this willow plant right here. Next slide, please. That's the way it looked in the 80s when I did my dissertation research. There's still a bridge there. There's water in the stream. Next slide, please. And that's the way it looks today. Next slide, please. Okay, in addition to these photographs, I think Dr. Peak is still here. This is one of Dr. Peak's photographs that he was kind enough to give me when I was doing my dissertation research. So in addition to the repeat photo stands on the northern range, the open range, there are a number of long-term aspen and willow exclosures. What an exclosure is, you put up an 8-foot fence, and then you look at the difference, this side is where the elk graze, this side is where the elk don't graze. This exclosure was built in the 1940s. This is a picture that Dr. Peak took in the 1960s on it. You can see the willows under 10 to 15 years protection. They're all almost up to the top of the 8-foot fence, and these are the willows that are dying outside because they're repeatedly browsed. So this is 62. Next slide. Takes a while for the aspen stands to start cooking to build up their root reserves after they've been highly degraded on it. So this is 88 when I did it. You can see the aspen is just taken off. Next slide, please. That's the way it looks today. There's been no recovery to any of the aspen and willow outside of any of the long-term exclosures. I did not build the long-term exclosures. I did not cite the long-term exclosures, but I measured them. And I repeated all the photographs that they've done over the time. Okay. What I've done in southern Utah under a different contract, because aspen's declining on a large piece of a large area of private property outside of Cedar City, and the legislature gives them $180,000 a year to figure out what's going on. It's called the Cedar Mountain Conservation Initiative. They have no long-term exclosures there, but under a contract, I submitted a proposal, and I measured every existing long-term aspen exclosure in southern Utah, which was 77. I've personally measured more aspen exclosures than anybody who has ever lived and probably ever will live again, because the damn government is not maintaining these things. These things are worth a fortune. They're invaluable. I mean, if you lose $1 million piece of equipment, it's just money, you go buy it. You want a 60-year-old exclosure, you got to put up an 8-foot fence and wait 60 years. And I don't know about you people, but I'm not going to be around 60 years from now. Next slide, please. Beaver. Beaver. According to all those websites and all those academic papers in the leading scientific journals, supposedly, in the world, beaver are coming back in Yellowstone. Turns out there's only one long-term beaver data set in Yellowstone Park. In the 1920s, a man named Warren did a detailed beaver survey around a small portion of where Tower Junction is, sort of the center of the northern range in the park. And I think he identified there was 13 or 14 different colonies and 232 beaver. So this is the North Fork of Elk Creek in the 20s. You can see the willows are short-statured because the elk have been chewing on them. The elk have been chewing on this aspen stand. And other people, not I, have gone back in there and taken sediment out of this pond, and this beaver dam had been there for 2,000 years. Okay? Next slide, please. That's the way a man named Jonas, who was a park naturalist or biologist in the 50s, redid the survey, and that's the way it looked in the 50s. Next slide, please. That's when I did it in the late 80s, and the slide again today. Next slide, please. You see any beaver? You see any recovery or aspen and willows? There's been some recovery. The stream channel changed and down cut on it, but 80 to 90% of these shrubs, and so they're down in a hole. It's like an 8-foot deep ditch when the stream blew out, and they're mainly alder. There's a few willows, but no elk in his right mind wants to crawl down in that 8-foot hole when there's predators around. So that's the long-term beaver set. So wolves haven't restored the country. Next slide, please. If not wolves, or not carnivores, what then historically kept elk and bison numbers from overgrazing Yellowstone? What do you think? It turns out, I hate to say this, but I'll say it anyhow, I'm the world's expert on Aboriginal influences in the original state of nature, and the only reason I can say that, no one was dumb enough to take this subject, because let me tell you, there's no money in it, and all there is arrows aimed at you by just about me, by everybody on all sides of this type of stuff. But they were the ultimate keystone species, the ultimate keystone predators, and if you're interested in this subject, I recommend a book to you on Australia. It's called The Greatest Estate on Earth. What the Europeans saw when they stepped off the boat in Australia had not been created by God or nature, but by Aboriginal people, and the same thing happened here in the Americas. Next slide, please. Why is hunting, what the Park Service says now, they're into this thing, and your Park Service is too, into this natural ecological processes. Okay, whatever the hell that means. Well, why isn't hunting a natural ecological process? Because it turns out, Val was right, we don't need any national parks, and I would say we need to deauthorize the ones that exist, because they're all racist. Why aren't humans part of a natural ecological process? In the same way, why aren't Aboriginal set fires part of a natural ecological process? And if you invite me back, I got a slideshow that I can talk on that subject for hours. Next slide, please. Okay, now none of this here has appeared in the scientific literature. I just discovered this last year. Part of some of my study sites were down in Jackson Hole in a place called the Grovant. And since I'm going to die one of these days, and Cliff White is picking up and doing some long-term research. He did his PhD on aspen from north of Jasper down to the Canadian border for a PhD from UBC on it. And so I wanted to meet him down there and show him some stuff, and I went and I saw this. This is wolves. Now you know I'm crazy, right? What the hell do wolves have to do with a hay barn? Well, it has to do with where it is and what is that hay for. Next slide, please. This is the Grovant. If you've ever been there's a town of Jackson, but that whole big valley is called Jackson Hole. The Teton Mountains are to the west of it in Grand Teton National Park. Open, this is elk winter range. Next slide. This is a set of the hay barns. There's 3 elk feed grounds up the Grovant, where the state of Wyoming has fed approximately 1,000 elk at each of those feed grounds going back to the early 1900s. And in fact, Wyoming has 22 feed grounds in northwest Wyoming that they feed approximately 25,000 elk on. So anybody who tells you you can't keep elk alive by feeding them needs to talk to Wyoming Game and Fish, because they've been doing it for a long time. Now, I don't particularly agree with elk feeding because it concentrates too many elk. They have a disease problem. They're all full of brucellosis, and everybody's sort of shaking in their boots what's going to happen when chronic wasting disease gets there and stuff. Next slide, please. So why are the hay barns built like this? Okay. Next slide, please. Because of this. These are my friends. This is not in Jackson Hole, but Mike Schaefer here and his wife at the time, they've since been divorced on it. They feed elk on 2 feed grounds under contract to the state. Next slide, please. With the hay barn built like this, you can drop haystacks, bales off of this side and off of this side. Next slide, please. And there they are. Now, why haven't wolves decimated this? Well, I can tell you what not to do, okay? Mike's sort of a wild person. In fact, most of his friends don't understand how he lived to be as old as he is. But there's a lot of flat, private ground before you get to where this feed ground is. And this is all closed to the public. Unless I was his friend, you wouldn't be able to get here. It's a long way back in. So they catch coyotes out on the flat sometimes. And with these new snow machines, I mean, they'll scare you how much power they have. So they run them down with snow machines. Well, he tried that on a coyote once. On a wolf once. 120, 150-pound wolf. busted up his snow machine, something horrible. The wolf landed in his lap, and the wolf was not dead. He had to shoot the wolf in self-defense with his pistol. Next slide, please. And the thing about feeding, even the littlest Bambi gets to eat. Next slide, please. So now you have these hay barns there, and I've sort of given the punchline away here already. And it's all old hay. Next slide, please. I mean, it's old, rotten hay. I saw that, and I realized they hadn't fed elk for 2 or 3 years. So there was 3,000 elk on feed, 2,000 elk at free range, and the wolves blew them out of the country. This has not been reported. But that's what happened. Next slide, please. So again, the habitat's still there, comes in hay bales, okay? But the elk aren't. This is not in Jackson Hole. This is when I was working for a rancher that had a too many elk problem. Our problem in Utah is we have way, way too many elk. Next slide, please. Now, in Jackson Hole, prior to wolves being released, and again, this is Wyoming Game and Fish numbers, there was an estimated 5,000 moose, lots of moose permits. They're down to less than 500. Most of the moose seasons have been closed, and for the life of them, the biologists cannot figure out what happened. The state biologists in Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming were basically complicit with federal wolf recovery. And Jim Beers is going to talk about that, about the government bureaucracy, because he worked for the Fish and Wildlife Service and the things that they did. Okay. I better not say that. Next slide. Interspecific aggression. What does this mean? This means aggression within a species. At what rate do wolves kill other wolves? Okay. I don't know what they do here, but in the States, there's these various groups that are promoting wolves. They have, quote, tame wolves, which Val knows they're not really tame wolves, so you have to be very careful. But they bring them into schools and let the school kids pet them, okay? Next slide. Okay, based on wolf kill rates of other wolves reported by Dr. David Meach, again, this is not my data. If you don't believe Dr. Meach, who would you believe? Reported by the federal government for an unhunted wolf population. The wolf population is not hunted in Alaska. Okay, so they have a kill rate there. And then what I compared that with is what the human murder rate is in the United States. And you know how us bastards are back in the United States. We got guns coming out of every pocket and everything else, and everybody's just dying right and left down in the United States, right? So the wolf kill rate of these peaceful, family-loving animals is 7,000 times higher than the murder rate in the United States. Okay? Next slide, please. Cats. Cats do not like each other either. They kill each other every chance they get. Again, there was a study, detailed study. It's called The Desert Puma. It's a great big book. Actually, the researchers were part of Hornacker's Research Institute. It's in White Sands, New Mexico. It's a military base. They used to shoot rockets, big rockets from Utah down to White Sands. And I think the first atomic bomb was called Trinity. I'm not sure, but they torched it off at White Sands. Okay, so there's no public access. Again, unhunted mountain lion population. Cats kill cats at a rate of 3,000 times the human murder rate. Now, you're not supposed to anthropomorphize these animals, but the other side does it, so what the heck? Next slide, please. Intraspecific aggression. This is the rate that wolves kill cats, and this is the rate that cats kill wolves. And how often do they do it? Next slide, please. As often as they can. Okay, this is a hunter here in western Montana, and that's what he found there. And the cats like to cover their kills. Next slide, please. And that's what was underneath all the brush. Next slide, please. You need some cat guts for your guitar. This is near Sun Valley in Idaho. Multi-million-dollar shacks. Next slide. Okay, now this is really, really, really important. And nobody talks about it. Your game biologists have no idea what I'm probably talking about unless they read the current literature on predation. It's called the landscape of fear or an ecology of fear. This has been a hot topic in predator-prey ecology with a whole outpouring of papers and books in recent years. You can have the best wildlife habitat on Earth, and if the animals, the prey animals, well, deer, moose, anything, are afraid of using it because of their being killed or their young being killed, they're not going to use it. Okay? This is called non-lethal effects, and what the data shows from some studies, the non-lethal effects of just constant harassment by the predators can have a greater impact on ungulate numbers than direct mortality. Think of open cows. Think if you're a farmer or rancher. Okay, your cattle are being harassed so much they don't conceive or they abort. There's an interesting study in central Idaho. It was actually done by some extension people because the wildlife people would never do it. This rancher was having problems with wolves killing his calves, and they told him, well, just put a rider out there. And the rider worked. There was no more attacks during the day. Well, the wolves switched to being nocturnal. And so they had GPS-collared wolves and GPS-collared cows, and you play the computer, and you can watch the wolves chase the cattle all the midnight long. Okay, next slide, please. This is in Jasper National Park, very northern part of it. It's on the Snake Indian River. This is Cliff White with Parks Canada. Dick Decker, remember I mentioned Dick Decker, the only rational wolf advocate I've ever met. I met him at various meetings in Canada, and what he told me was he spent 30, 40 years sitting on places up here watching the wolves take the elk in the Snake Indian River. And what Dick told me was, since the wolves have come in, they've dropped the elk numbers by 90%. When's the first time or last time you've ever heard a wolf advocate tell you that they've dropped any ungulate population by any measure at all, let alone 90%? And then what Dick said, well, the elk are now gone and all the aspen regenerated. Well, no one in the history of science had reported that before. And at first I didn't believe Dick, so I had to go see it myself. And in order to use the warden cabin at Willow Creek, I had to take some wardens in with me. So Cliff came from Banff and Nick Galopacane came from Ottawa. And this is there's a whole series of meadows there, and along the edge of the meadows, the aspen's just doing fine. And Cliff worked all this out for his PhD from UBC on it, counted wolf scats and things on it. So this is in the meadows. Next slide, please. This slide's taken the same day. Okay, this is the same day. I'm not messing this up. This is about a half mile or more from those main meadows. So the best elk habitat is in the meadows. But the elk aren't there anymore. So they're still back in the woods on it, and the aspen there is not recovered at all. This is called the landscape of fear, and you can actually see it. Next slide, please. And I have not even mentioned coyote predation. Next slide, please. Or surplus killing. Next slide, please. That's all they ate. 3 dead deer for a mouthful. Next slide, please. And I haven't had time to mention anything about the data that's been collected on wolf predation or predation in the North Country by the Alaska Department of Fish and Game or the Yukon Department or whatever they call it, Bob Hayes' research. But what those data show is the combined predation pressure by bears and wolves will keep the moose and the caribou population, and even to some extent the Dall sheep, at 90% or less what the habitat would otherwise support. And then what Bob Hayes said in his book is, you add human hunting to that, on top of that, either white sport harvest or aboriginal harvest, and they take the ungulate population down to 0. So is there a solution? Well, I'll be happy to tell you that there is a solution. Next slide, please. Get on a jet to South, next slide. There's my solution to hunting in North America. I no longer hunt in Montana or Wyoming. I save my pennies, and every 3 or 4 years, I go to South Africa. They have a completely different system. The landowners own all the large game animals. There's 20 million head of plains game on private land in South Africa. 20 million head. It's all private property. There's no season, there's no limit. They sell live game animals. The meat, you don't own the meat. They sell that meat on it, you know. Next slide, please. And I know we're not supposed to talk about trophies, but the trophy hunting is outstanding. I mean, I spent my whole life hunting in the western United States. I made one trip to Canada to hunt caribou on the Central Arctic herd on it, hunting caribou with Inuit guides on Inuit land claims. I've killed more than 200 head in North American big game, except for that and an ibex hunt. All those hunts are self-hunts on public land. And a couple sheep hunts, couple goat hunts, couple moose hunts. And I've never put anything in Boone and Crockett. Come close, couple eighths here, couple eighths there. This is what's called an aurochs. It's 42 inches, 11-inch bases. At the time I killed him, he was number 33 in the world. Looks great on the wall. And by the way, you can invite me back to this. Trophy management, trophy hunting, is the epitome of land management, and I can explain that to you too. Okay? Next slide, please. Thank you very much for your time in inviting me here today. And if you don't know what this is an eland, about 2,000 pounds. Thank you very much.